Welcome to the Message podcast of Werribee Baptist Church, a vibrant church located west of Melbourne, Australia. Dedicated to creating a welcoming and safe space for everyone to explore and grow their faith in God, our vision is to see hope multiplied within our community and around the world. We hope this podcast serves as a source of encouragement and spiritual growth for you. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to journeying with you in faith.
My 5-year-old granddaughter, a couple of weeks ago, she was talking to her mom and dad, and she said, Mama and Pop, that's Deanna and I, are really lucky because they only work one day. You know, that was like a knife in my heart because that's a common joke about pastors. And you've probably heard that. Many of you may have even said that. But that is a 5-year-old unlearned perception, okay? So we got some work to do there. I told them, well, tell her if she thinks that we're so lucky that one day she can grow up and be a pastor. So she should work towards that. And anybody else that's thinking that, hey, let me know, and we'll put you in the pipeline and see what we can do about making you a pastor. What does it take to be a pastor? We've been going through a series called Assembly Required. It's a letter, we're studying a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a young pastor named Timothy, and he was pastoring a church in Ephesus in the first century. And we've learned so far that when you're putting a church together, you have to read the instructions. We've learned that all the pieces matter. There are no extra bits, no matter how much we try to convince our wives when we put something together, those extra bits didn't matter. They all matter. And God uses broken pieces as well. And last week, we learned that we don't need to be divided over debatable things. So now we're up to a place where Paul starts talking about the church and who gets to lead it. But if you missed any of those other messages, go to our website, go to our app, go to our YouTube channel, like, share, all those things so that you can get this content to your friends and people that need it more than you do, because I know you guys are all right up there, right? So you hear messages so you can tell other people what to do in their lives, right? Are you with me? Okay. So today we're looking at who leads the church and what that should look like. And before you check out thinking, oh, that's not about me, the pastor today is just preaching to himself and the other pastors, the elders, and those things, hang on a minute. Because there's some good stuff here. There's some good principles that I reckon are going to be very applicable for your life. And besides that, when we think about our world and society, every Christian should be leading the way in the things we're going to talk about today, okay? We should be the most upstanding citizens out there, and we should be leading the way in things. So you're all leaders, and this applies to all of you. So let's get stuck in. 1 Timothy chapter 3 says, Paul writing says this, "This is a trustworthy saying. If someone aspires to be a church leader, he desires an honorable position." Right away, we see that in the church, there needs to be some structure. It's a living organism, but it's an organization, and you need some structure around it. What we see, and we're going to look at through the rest of this chapter, is descriptive of what was going on in Ephesus. And we've said this before through the series. We need to understand when things are being descriptive, they're not necessarily always prescriptive, but we can learn principles that are important. So he also talks about church leaders, and a lot of different words fit under that category. Some translations will call them bishops, some will say elders, pastors, and then in verse 8 we're going to see another word called deacons. And I want to, for the sake of today, for time largely, to incorporate all of those into one: church leaders. The bishops, elders, pastors, that's all the same word anyway, in the same office. So Paul's saying, trustworthy saying. He starts out with that because he had to make sure that you were going to believe him, because what he says next is unbelievable. It was unbelievable that he would say, those who aspire to be a church leader desire an honorable position. It would not have been seen as an honorable position. It was seen as hard work, a hard slog. People got persecuted for being church leaders, and that still happens today. In fact, what I tell people, if they are aspiring towards a leadership position in a church, I say, if you can do anything else, do it. All right? Because it's not easy. And we're going to find out later today at the end of the message, it's about a calling. So if you can do anything else, that would mean that you're probably not called. So go do that other thing because your life's going to be a little bit easier. Not as fulfilled because this is the most amazing job in the world, I promise you. But anyway, being a leader in a church aspires to. I don't know about you. Does anybody not aspire to things in life? Anybody in the room? You have no initiative, no drive, no ambitions. Anybody? All right, I see one. All right, okay. There's a few. Hey, I can't relate to that. I don't understand that at all. I'm a very driven person. But when I was working at the previous organization I was with, the mission organization, I had a young lady that worked for me. She was on my team, and she was my right arm. She was amazing and wonderful. But every year in her annual review, one of the questions we ask would be, what are your long-term aspirations? And the first couple of years, she would just look at me blankly. Don't know. Yeah. And then she caught onto it, and she knew I was going to ask. So I said, what are your long-term aspirations in the years that followed? And she would always say, to have long-term aspirations. That's what she was aspiring to in the end. So that was great. That was growth for her. So if you don't aspire to anything, that's okay. Maybe there's still hope for you. But if you're aspiring to be a church leader, and dare I suggest a leader in any arena, whether it be a school or the marketplace or whether even your home, the reasons for being a leader need to be not about power, not about position, not about prestige. It needs to be about making a difference in the world and making the people who you lead's lives better, okay? So if you're aspiring to leadership because you think, well, I want to be the leader because that makes me important and all that, set all that aside and answer the question, do I want to make a difference in the world? Do I want people around me to be better because I'm leading them? So when you think about all of that, we need to think about what kind of a leader would you look for? Who would you choose to follow? And what follows in our text today are a list of qualifications for both elders, deacons, pastors, and they are there's only slight differences between the elders and the deacons, so we're not going to get into the deacons at the end because they're very similar. But in society, there were lists of qualifications for jobs. Much like if you went on Seek.com, you would find all kinds of qualifications for things like any job you would aspire to, actually. But in the first century, they would actually list qualifications for things like generals, politicians, for midwives, and Christian leaders as well. It was very common. And I'm going to suggest to you that as we go through this list of qualifications today, it's actually surprisingly low, the bar that is set. And I say that not because it's not a high bar, it's actually a decent bar, but it's things that we should all be aspiring to. It shouldn't be for people who just want to lead the church. Every Christian should aspire to these things. And I would suggest that even if you're not a Christian, if you want to be a good, upstanding member of society, these are good character qualities for you to have. So as we unpack these things, there's three different categories that we're going to look at. As we unpack them, I want you to look at your own life, not just the life of the leaders in the church, but look at your own life and answer this question. How can I build a life worth following? How can I build a life that is worthy of following? First of all, in verse 2, Paul says, so a church leader must be a man whose life is above reproach. Right out of the gate, building a life worth following means that we need to have a foundation. It begins with a foundation of character. That word above reproach means not deserving of criticism, and it carries with it a legal connotation. The idea was not to do things where people could bring up legal charges against you. That's literally what that phrase means. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that you're not even going to be criticized. It doesn't mean that there won't be accusations even thrown against you. In the first century, there was a guy called Jesus. You might have heard of him if you're a church person. Was he ever criticized? Right? Did he get accused of things? Right? but he wasn't deserving of that criticism or accusations. That's what above reproach means. It doesn't mean that people won't try to take you down. It means there will be no validity to the things that they are saying in that space. So moving on, Paul then says he must be faithful to his wife. That phrase creates lots of controversy, lots of division amongst churches, and lots of confusion for theologians and scholars. And we talked a lot about it last week, and we could easily continue the discussion about women's roles in ministry this week. But go back to last week's message if you really want to do a deep dive there. I'm going to make just a few observations very quickly and then get on to the rest of it. See, the language in this chapter where you will continually see he and him throughout the qualifications. He must be this, he must be that, so on and so on. All of those he's and hims are inserted for readability. In the original language, in the Greek, there are no pronouns there, okay? So that's inserted for our readability. Now, this phrase that he must be faithful to his wife, that one is male-oriented. It is telling men that they have to be faithful to their wife. It's the only list that makes a clear male designation. Now, it does make a male designation, but I would suggest to you it does not eliminate females from these offices, because we have significant amounts of places in Scripture that show us women held these types of offices. In Romans chapter 16, Paul addresses a lady called Junius. She was an apostle. And he addresses Phoebe. She was a deacon. So we have instances where we see women in leadership roles in churches. So we don't need to eliminate women. It's also very pertinent to know that Paul, who writes in 3 separate times in Romans, Ephesians, and 1 Corinthians, he writes letters to these churches talking about spiritual gifts. And he tells them to use their spiritual gifts. And he doesn't say, here's the men gifts, here's the women gifts. And he tells all of his readers in 1 Corinthians 12, male and female, they're reading, saying, pursue the greatest gifts. Right after he's talked about apostles and pastors and teachers. Okay? So again, if we put that whole argument aside for the rest of the talk today about can this be men or women and all of that, let's don't go there anymore, because clearly, and as a church, we've decided women can fill these roles. So we come back to it says he needs to be faithful to his wife. Jewish culture, until the 10th century, practiced polygamy, okay? And some would suggest that that's why Paul was telling Timothy that the elders needed to be faithful to their wives. You can't have multiple wives. Well, that is certainly good advice, I would reckon, because guys, can you imagine having multiple wives? Why? Mine's so amazing. How in the world would I deal with it anymore? Anyway, how did I get out of that? Coming back. That would have been for everybody in the church, not just the leaders. So we're not talking about polygamy here. And it would have been talking about everybody. But some of the other questions that surround this is, well, what about someone who is divorced? Because are they having one wife? Because some people translate this literally as husband of one wife. Well, I would suggest to you that divorce is not an immediate disqualification from being an elder, pastor, deacon, all those things. I would also suggest to you it depends on the circumstances. Have they been faithful to their wife? Are they faithful to their wife now? Are they living a life that is representative of this qualification right here? Are they doing that? You know, and I've seen this play out in a couple different ways. I've seen women leave their husbands thinking that was good. They were not going to be qualified for ministry anymore. The men were not going to be qualified for ministry anymore, and take themselves out. I've also seen men who have cheated on their wives and gone on to create another family and then pastor somewhere else and never have any remorse or regret for what they had done in leaving their wives. Now, I think one of those potentially is legitimate for still being a pastor. One of them is not. And you can sort out which one those are. Then the other thing, if we're going to be faithful to our spouse, the question comes up, what about single people? Can they be pastors? Or does that mean they have to have a spouse to be faithful to? And I would suggest to you that this verse is not insisting that everybody be married. I had a dear friend who was a single man. He was a pastor, and his church was thriving. And there was a meeting of a group of pastors that came together. It was when I was visiting Australia to check out whether God was calling us here. And I was at this meeting, and at the end of the meeting, there was 3 or 4 other pastors who said, hey, we want to stay around a little while and talk with him. You know, and he was the single guy who was actually hosting the meeting at his home. And these guys were not in a part of thriving ministries. And I would suggest they were jealous of what was going on with him. And they were challenging him about the fact that he was single, that he should not be a pastor. And this guy felt pressure, not just from that, but just everybody around him was trying to, fix him up with the different people and everything. And he did want to get married. He ended up getting married to someone that was suggested for him and things through a long process. And long story short, I won't give you any details, but it did not go well at all. And I would suggest to you a large part of that's because of the pressure he was feeling. The other thing, if this is a mandate for all time that people have to be married to be in ministry, what about Paul? And what about Jesus? Right? They would have been eliminated from being your pastors. And by the way, if Paul or Jesus were either one here, I would suggest to you, you should get rid of me and have them as your pastor. And they're both single guys. So anyway, moving on. The idea here is that the church leader should live their lives in a way that they're an example of what a monogamous marriage relationship should look like. A person who is faithful to his wife or a woman who is faithful to her husband shows strong character. That's the point here. They're faithful to the commitment that they've made. And I would suggest this goes even further because we're talking about the foundation of character. That when someone makes a commitment to whatever they're making a commitment to, you should be able to depend on them and trust their word that they're going to fulfill the commitments they make. So moving on to some other things. He says, he must exercise self-control, live wisely, and have a good reputation. He must be gentle, not quarrelsome, and not love money. Foundational character issues, building blocks here. Self-controlled means sober-minded, means they're serious about things. They understand the seriousness of issues in life. They're free from excessive influence based on their passions or their emotions. A person that is sober-minded measures their words carefully. They don't just say the first thing that pops in their head. Because the first thing that pops in our head many, many, many times should not be coming out of our mouths. How many of us know that? Right? The rest of us need to learn that. Okay? Because the first thing in your mind is not always the best thing to come out of your mouth. And this isn't the person that in a meeting at their office or in the home, when things don't go their way, they've got a big family dinner and a holiday, things aren't going their way, and they blow the whole thing up and storm out and make a big deal about everything. That's not a person that's being sober-minded. And then it says, lives wisely. Lives wisely is closely associated with the sober-minded. It's understanding and self-restraint, being self-disciplined in freedoms. I like to say it's doing what is wise above what is legal. We might have freedom. We might be legal to do whatever it is that we're wanting to do, but it may not be the wisest thing to do. That's what Paul's talking about here. He says they should have a good reputation. That means they live their lives orderly, not in chaos. The self-control and wise living is made evident and is visible through their good reputation. And then it says they're gentle. They're not quarrelsome. They're not people that are looking for a fight. They're people who are looking to make peace. They're people who look to show mercy to others, not to punish others. Then it says, not a lover of money, and it's repeated in verse 8, talking about the deacons, and that's translated as greedy. It's the same idea. Must not be obsessed with making money. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. If you're aspiring to build a life worth following, it can't be about money. Some people will want to follow you if you have money, but again, that's not the character building things that we're talking about here. Far too often, leaders in churches and other spaces have been chosen and appointed based on charisma, to the neglect or to the dismissing of character issues. And friends, when you choose charisma over character, it's going to fall apart every time. I like to suggest that there's nothing wrong with charisma. There's nothing wrong with competence. And those things may get you in the room. Those may get you a position. Those may get you to the table. But if you don't have character, you're not going to stay there, because character is what keeps you there. That's foundational. He goes on, he says, must not be a heavy drinker or be violent. So we're building a solid foundation of character, and on top of that, a life worth following will exhibit godly conduct. See, character and conduct are intertwined. Our conduct flows from our character. And there's a couple of things that he lists here. He says, not a heavy drinker. Not a heavy drinker. Now, I came from a tradition, a faith tradition that said a pastor can't drink at all. So for years and years and years, I never drank. And I thought that it was against the law to drink. But what this says, it says not a heavy drinker. You're not to be given to drink. It's not talking about total abstinence, because in chapter 5, verse 23, Paul told Timothy, take some wine for your stomach's sake. Timothy had ulcers because of pastoring, okay? That's what was going on there. Actually, it may have not been ulcers. It may have been something else. But Paul said, take a little bit of wine. It's okay. But don't be addicted to it. Don't be dependent on it. Don't be controlled by it. And this is just practical wisdom, because think about it. Who wants to be led by someone who's making decisions when they're drunk? Right? That would just be silly, right? So this is practical things. It's not really rocket science that you don't want a drunk to be the leader. And then it says, not violent. The word violent there could literally be translated as bully. And as I was preparing this week, and I thought about all the churches that I've known, been a part of, and churches that I see from a distance around the world, I say a lot of them that have like extreme hierarchical structures where the lead pastor or senior pastor is the bottom line authority of absolutely everything. And some of these people have ruled with an iron fist, and they've abused their staff, they've abused their church members and things, and they've let power go to their head, and they literally are a bully. Paul is telling Timothy that kind of conduct is not okay in a church leader. And dare I say, once again, it's not okay for any of us to go around bullying people and things like that. Moving on, he says this in verse 4. He must manage his own family well, having children who respect and obey him. For if a man cannot manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? Families are the building block for society. As the family goes, so goes society. As the family goes, so goes the church, and any other place that you want to talk about. In the first century, where Paul's writing there at Ephesus, politicians were often judged by the conduct of their kids. And everybody in society was, what your kids did reflected either poorly or positively on you as parents. As I thought about that, this is a really tricky one. Because when do your kids stop being kids? I've got children that are older than a lot of you, and they're still my kids. And some days I'm excited about that, and some days my heart's broken, and some days I'm cheering them on. Some days I'm wanting to choke them, but I don't because I can't be violent, right? Because I'm a pastor. Man, some days it'd be nice. Anyway. When does this apply that, okay, if your kids are off the rails, does that disqualify you? Well, I would suggest to you that kids are going to have a free will. God created all of us with a free will. And if your kid goes off the rails and you're trying to identify, is this me or not? Can I still be in leadership in a church setting? Or is my character good enough, my conduct good enough? It's not about whether your kids are obeying everything and falling in line and doing all the right things. I would suggest to you that you look at the leaders and you ask, okay, their kids are a mess right now. Why and what are they doing? How are the parents responding? Those are the questions that you really need to ask, because you can't control every action of another person, whether they're your kid or not. So you need to evaluate, how are they handling the situation? Moving on. He said, he must enjoy having guests in his home, and he must be able to teach. Strong character, good conduct, but now building a life that's worth following. It's going to display some competence. Okay, competence. Character is the most important. Then out of the character is going to flow conduct. Now we look at some competence. He says, be hospitable, host people, even strangers, people in need. So a leader needs to be someone who cares about other people that are in need. That's what he's saying here. And then he says, able to teach. They need to be able to handle the Word of God properly, able to communicate it well. And that is a gifting towards pastoral leadership. Moving on. By the way, we're moving on. So competence took just that long. Character took that long. Make notes. That's what's most important. He says a church leader must not be a new believer because he might become proud and the devil would cause him to fall. Also, people outside the church must speak well of him so that he will not be disgraced and fall into the devil's trap. Now, when it comes to building the church, we've been talking about building lives, but specifically about the church. When it comes to building up the church, the leadership is a calling. It's not just an aspiration for the person. It is a calling. God calls, people discern. In chapter 5, verse 22, it says, don't be in a hurry to appoint someone into these positions because they need to be tried and tested. They need to not be a new believer because then they'll get proud of their position and everything. And that goes back to character all over again. And that's going to cause a fall because the devil's going to attack there. He talks in chapter 5, verse 19 about accusations against an elder. And church leaders need to be very protective about this because they don't want to create scandal by the way that they're living. They've got to have the calling. And then Paul says, and if there's a problem with your leader, take 2 or 3 witnesses and make sure that what the accusations are actually true before you do anything about it because we don't want scandals. Verse 10 says deacons must be tested. Then we could go through verses 8 through 13 and we look at the qualifications of a deacon. They're mostly the same with the major exception being it doesn't call them to teach. And then another section in verse 11, it says this. In the same way, their wives must be respected and must not slander others. They must exercise self-control and be faithful in everything they do. The words their wives could also be translated the women deacons, okay? So if you do a deep dive and study there, it could say the women deacons. And based on the context, I think that's actually what it means. Because if it was just talking about wives and setting a standard for wives of deacons, how come there was no standard set for wives of elders, right? That doesn't make sense that a deacon's wife would be have higher expectations than an elder's. It says they don't need to be slanderers, gossips, and backbiting. Pastor D's going to talk about all that kind of stuff in a couple of weeks, and I'll look forward to hearing that. But why is it important in the church that we have good structures, that we have qualified leaders? Remember, Paul's talking to Timothy about false teaching in the church, people trying to create major problems at Ephesus. So Paul goes back to the purpose of the church. If you've got your copy of the scriptures, this won't be on the screen. But in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, verse 14, it says, I'm writing these things to you now, even though I hope to be with you soon, so that if I'm delayed, you will know how people must conduct themselves in the household of God. This is the church of the living God, which is the pillar and foundation of the truth. Without question, this is the great mystery of our faith. Christ was revealed in human body, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, and announced to the nations. He was believed in throughout the world and taken to heaven in glory. We've talked a lot today about the church needing structure. The church is a living organism. It's a living, breathing organism. It's the body of Christ. But it does need some organization in societies to function. But Paul's saying, I'm giving you all this instruction, but never, never, never forget that it's all about Jesus. Never forget that it's about Him crucified and risen again and sitting in heaven right now. And the structures and all the things that I'm telling you to put in place, those are going to help you promote the fact that it's all about Jesus. Don't ever forget that and be distracted by all the ancillary things. So where does all this land for us? How do we apply it as a church? Well, we believe that our leaders need to meet the qualifications we've just talked about. We look at character, and we look at their conduct, and we look at their competencies to see if they are a good fit when we're looking for staff members. Our structure in this church is that our congregation makes the decisions. They do most of that through the empowerment of a church council that they appoint. That church council is my boss. I'm the lead pastor, and I report to them. Then I lead the pastoral team. We also have elders. We've used that term a bit here today. Elders in our church, in our context, are there to do some of the practical things, mostly care for people. That's the way we've structured that. And they meet those qualifications, the character, the conduct, and the competency. And can I just make a side note about elders? In a church our size, we need lots of elders because there's lots of you to care for. And if that's not going to all fall back to the pastors. In fact, Acts chapter 6 is where deacons came up to start with. And they were doing that so that the pastors could be freed to do the teaching and praying and things like that. We need more. You need to be a member to do that. So everybody join the church, and then I'm going to come find you and ask you to be an elder. But personally, do you want to build a life worth following? I hope that you do. I hope that isn't just for the church leaders. We all want to build a life worth following. Can I encourage you, first and foremost, lead yourself if you want to build a life worth following. And that's the hardest person that you're ever going to lead, is yourself. That's the character thing. If you have a family, lead your family well. That's your conduct. They're going to see your character. They're the people that know you best. They're going to be the ones that are going to say whether or not you actually are who you say you are. And then when we look at our competency, we can lead others. So how's your character? It's the foundation. With a faulty foundation, everything else will crumble. How's your conduct? Is the way you behave consistent with your character or who you say that you are? And how's your competency? Those are your gifts. Those are your abilities. Are you developing those and using those for service? As I prepared this week and everything, I hate preaching this passage because it's like, am I building a life worth following? And I'm confronted and I'm challenged and I think, okay, need to be careful, need to make sure. How's my character? How's my conduct? How's my competency? But can I encourage you to be people, not just leaders, who are evaluating those things in your lives too? Are you a person who is building a life worthy of following? You might have a lot of followers on social media. You might have a lot of friends on Facebook. But are you building a life that's worth following? Father, thank you for what we have seen here today in the qualifications for leaders. Lord, as we consider the qualifications you set for leaders, Lord, help us to be Christians who are leading the way in society. Help us to desire these things for ourselves so that we have good reputations. So that those on the outside looking in would say we are people of character. Our conduct that is enviable. Even if they don't believe like us, they would still believe that we're decent people. And Lord, help us to develop the things that you have given us as far as gifts so that we can honor you with the way we live our lives. In Jesus' name.